What's up, fellas? Doing another question answering video. Thank you guys, as always, for participating. It means a lot to me. And if you have any questions that you would like my opinion on, leave them in the comments of this video, or you can put them in the community post that I'll put up probably the day before I make the next one of these. So getting straight into the questions. The first question is a two-part question, training. How effective is upping frequency for the big three? For example, in a 4-week cycle, benching 3x instead of benching 2x. As always, that's going to be context dependent. So if it's within your recovery capabilities, just adding in another verbatim session is always going to be super beneficial. If you're benching once a week and you could do basically that exact workout, maybe you want to vary it just for the sake of sanity, twice and consistently recover, your results are going to be phenomenal. You're getting twice as much frequency as far as stimulating the muscles, and you're getting twice as much frequency as far as the specific motor skill you're working on. A lot of the times when we're increasing frequency, we won't be able to add in another verbatim session. We'll have to take the volume we're doing, cut it in half, and then put that in 2 sessions. So the amount of volume we're doing kind of remains the same, but we're stimulating the muscles at a greater frequency. And again, we're practicing our technique at a greater frequency. And then we can start pushing our way up into even higher frequencies. And we say we split our weekly volume across 3 sessions, kind of fiddle with maybe 1 harder session, 1 easier session. And you can get into 4, 5 sessions per week. And then at that point, usually what you're going to have to do is you're going to have to make some of the sessions just technical sessions. You're not doing enough work to really stimulate the muscle in a super significant way. We're not going to get very many neural adaptations from these days. It's just a way to practice the motor pattern even more often for someone who really wants to become skilled at that motion. So it's kind of a diminishing returns thing. Usually going from 1 to 2 yields phenomenal results, depending on how efficient they are, how much load is being moved. Moving from 2 to 3 can yield really good results muscularly and technique-wise, but going above 3, usually the biggest returns are going to be in how efficient your technique is and how skillful you are at the motion, more so than just extra stimulation for the pressing musculature. And then the second part of the question is, what is your opinion on the DIAAS? For those who don't know, a PDCAA score right now is a metric that is used to assess protein quality. It looks at the array of amino acids, the amino acids that we can't produce ourselves, the ratios of those to one another, and their digestibility to give proteins a score as far as protein quality. And what DIAAS, this is all from my memory from back when I was in college. So if I say anything inaccurate, please don't hesitate to correct me in the comments. I'm not about spreading false information. But a DIAAS is a proposed different scoring system for protein quality. So it's a replacement for the PDCAA score. Key differences off the top of my head, I know historically PDCAA scores are collected from fecal samples, whereas DIAAS score, I guess the S is score, so that's a little bit redundant, but DIAA scores are collected from samples in the ileum, which is probably a little bit more relevant. DIAA scores use pigs rather than mice, although I don't think using mice is inherent to a PDCAA score, so that's not necessarily a benefit to the DIAA score, because pigs are probably more analogous to humans than rats and mice are, and the scoring system itself is different, right? So in a PDCAA score, both soy and whey will score a perfect score of 1.0, whereas in a DIAA score, we can see a little bit more differentiation between the two, where the whey will outscore the soy to some degree. That being said, this is not my area of expertise, so please bear with me. That being said, I have heard some concern. It could just be because it's more preliminary. It could be a lack of data, but I have heard concern about the DIAA score in assessing the quality of plant-based or non-animal-based proteins, which is where I think these scores really hold their importance, is for subpopulations around the world who are not getting enough protein, so have protein-poor diets. Helping them source enough quality protein from affordable sources is where this stuff really shines. So if those concerns are true and it's not necessarily the best for assessing plant-based protein sources, then maybe that could be a problem. But what does that mean for us, meatheads who are trying to get big, strong muscles? Probably a little bit less important than the starving people, but nonetheless, what does that mean for us? And this is why I don't think it's all that important. The reason I think it's not important is because PDCAA scores are functional, What do I mean by that? I mean that when we establish and double check all of our DIAA score values, there's not going to be anything that turns our protein source selection on its head. Roughly the hierarchy is going to remain the same. The high quality proteins are going to remain the high quality proteins, the lesser quality proteins. Maybe we differentiate between them a little bit more, but the need for this insane accuracy doesn't really apply to our scenario. Nothing is really going to change about where we're selecting our protein sources based on the implementation of DIAA scores as far as I'm concerned. So I don't really worry about it too much because it's a little bit outside of my scope. As far as whether it's going to be valuable in that more clinical setting, I have no idea. I don't really know about these things. But that would be my opinion on it. I don't think it's going to have any bearing on how we go about doing things. The next question is, what are your methods of adding in powerlifts after a long off season of accessories and non-specific work, specifically a way to avoid generating too much fatigue too quickly? I have a way of doing this. I just wanted your thoughts. So if it's a powerlifter, we're never getting that far away from the lifts to where our somewhat specific work capacity decays. Barring an injury scenario, I just find much like deloading every 4 weeks is a waste of training time. Doing off seasons that significantly deviate from your primary goals, unless they're for mental burnout reasons, which is completely valid. Or if your goals aren't strictly powerlifting, also completely valid, right? And I know you work with guys other than just powerlifters. I find that for powerlifters, getting too far away from what we're trying to get skilled at just for the sake of it, just to off-season for the sake of off-seasoning, rather than to stave off, to get rid of some overuse injuries we might have, usually is worse than better. So generally speaking, I won't have to make that accommodation too often because we've kept a pretty specific work capacity via the small deviations we've done in the main lift for the off season, rather than big deviations or dropping them completely. But in the scenarios where I'm working with like someone Gen Pop and they just want to get away from the main lifts for a while and we're coming back, usually I'll just do exactly what I might do with a strongman motion, which is really annoyingly sub-maximal work to start, so that way we can establish a high technical base again before we start pushing weight. Because like you said, if you introduce them, as you're a professional, if you introduce the power lifts after some time away from them, you can accrue fatigue too quickly. But that's not because they're so good meat and potato motions above other stuff. It's because you're able to move more weight than you necessarily are prepared for. Just by being a stronger person from that off-season work, you can move a decent amount of weight, and your technique is probably going to be the worst it's going to be, so you're going to be the least mechanically efficient. So taking the time to establish mechanically efficient motor patterns usually goes a pretty long way, for then when you start pushing it, it bangs you up quite a bit less. And then diet-wise, what is your personal approach to managing Young King Max's surplus/diet phases? Pretty simple stuff. We've kind of boiled down to where we're eating roughly 300 grams of protein per day, maybe a little bit more at times, very rarely a little bit less. We've introduced some healthy fat sources because when Max was doing his own diet and he decided to clean it up, he kind of went with the bro mistake of eating nothing but clean food, lacking any significant fat sources. So his sleep went to shit, and I took over his diet, and we added in some fats. So added some quality fats. Again, the fats stay pretty constant around 0.35 times your body weight in grams, probably maybe a little bit more at times because Max doesn't have the same digestive issues I do. He can handle a bit more. So it's really not a big deal for him. Just some easy high density calories from the fat, but not that much more than we need for hormonal production. And then all of the calorie manipulation is going to be done using the carbs. So, if we're in a bulking phase, we just basically bump his rice. If we're in a cutting phase, we basically cut some of his rice. And that's kind of the model we've settled on. We keep, our fruits and veggies constant between bulking and cutting phases. We keep our, coconut water drinking through the day constant, even though it's a decent source of calories that could easily be cut. Don't really want to deal with cramping. That those calories could easily be cut in rice because he's eating so much to begin with. So usually that's how we do it. Pretty simple approach, nothing groundbreaking, just consistently doing that and maintaining those base variables in the fat, the proteins, and the micronutrient sources. Because we're getting most of our micronutrients from the fruits, vegetables, meats, those things don't change, right? So theoretically, when we go into a deficit, we're not entering a depleted state of any specific micronutrient because we're only cutting rice and we're only adding rice, which is pretty devoid of micronutrients. Next question. Many blanket recommendations for diet seem to work okay for everybody. Is there any area of nutrition that has the strongest individual variation, um, where they should experiment with adjusting things? Yeah, man, there's a lot of stuff like that, right? So it's like food selection is going to vary greatly based on digestion, and digestion, there's going to be a lot of individual variability. So food selection, I think, is an area where there is potential for a ton of variance from person to person. You know, we're kind of all following the same model. As when we want to gain weight, we eat a small surplus. When we want to lose weight, we lose, eat a small surplus deficit. Basically, I think we're all kind of following the same thing. Obviously, we all want to get our micronutrients, but where we get these things from is going to be very individual dependent on the sourcing, just due to digestion. And then the other thing I think varies a little bit is preferred macro ratios. I think some people generally, even if they're well sourced carbs, feel like dog shit if they eat a lot of carbs. So they might look at more of an equal energy sourcing diet, right? So the same amount of calories from protein, the same amount of calories from carbs, and the same amount of calories from fat. If that's someone who generally feels good on a little bit higher fat diet, maybe feels a little bit worse on a higher carb diet, take the protein nice and high, because that's a way you can fill calories. It doesn't make you feel like shit. Evan Centropani is a big advocate of the even energy balance diet. There's nothing wrong with it. I think that because as powerlifters, bodybuilders, even strongmen, our glycogen demands aren't that big. We don't need these crazy amounts of carbs. They can be beneficial because carbs are the only macro that has a theoretical indefinite benefit, as they are anti-catabolic and they are protein sparing. We don't need a ton to fuel performance. So if we were to go, let's say I would come in and I would eat like if I was a smaller guy, maybe I would eat a 300 protein, 300 carb, and probably be 140 fat if I were to ballpark that. And that would be roughly equal energy from each source. Something like that can work quite well for some people, and other people like myself, the fats need to be kept to the absolute minimum for basic function, and then filling the rest with either protein or carbs. So sometimes the ratios of the macros can just depend on the person, how they make them feel. Some people probably have a little bit more of a propensity to digesting certain macros well versus worse. Like I certainly can't seem to digest any fat source in any reasonable quantity well. So I think that it ultimately comes down to digestion, how you feel. That is the area for the biggest experimentation and adjusting, right? Whether that be digestion or energy levels. I would say that's the biggest thing, right? You can definitely mess around with your ratios. Some people just find that, like, hey, I understand the literature says that we don't really see that much benefit past 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, but that's an average. On average, we don't see that. Maybe you find that taking your protein to 1.5 grams, you feel amazing and you really feel like you're recovering better. That sounds valid to me. Go for it, man. Your subjective assessment of yourself, especially if you've been lifting for a while and you have a good feel for your training variables, and you're like, well, the only thing that's changed has been my protein intake, and I've been performing significantly better. That is a valid little case study in itself, as long as you're controlling the other variables well and you're familiar with what your performance metrics generally look like. Hope that answers the question. If you have anything more specific, please let me know. I'm more than happy to babble about nutrition stuff all the time. How would you approach carbs on an off day if cardio is done after lifts? Okay, so you're not doing any cardio on the off day, I assume that means. How would I approach carbs? Generally speaking, there's kind of two ways you can view this. There's the, hey, we're not using as much energy on this day. We should probably shave off that energy in carbs, so dropping the carbs slightly on the off days, especially for someone who has a propensity to accidentally gain weight or a history of being overweight. That's probably what I would recommend, is just shaving off some carbs on the days where your energy expenditure is lower. Or some people find that eating more on their off days is a good way to feel recovered, right? To come into that next day, you're like, well, yeah, no, I ate a bigger caloric surplus yesterday because I didn't burn off as many calories, and I come into the next day feeling just super strong. That's how it is for me, is if I can put down enough food. In the absence of exercise, it's hard for me to put it down as much food as I usually eat. But if I do, I feel like a tank the next day, and I don't have a history of being overweight. I've had to work very hard to get this fat. So it's something that I will do myself, but I certainly wouldn't recommend as a universal. The next question is, what is your take on neck training? It's a good way to build your neck. If you want a big neck, like visually, that can be done. If you want to be slightly more resilient to concussions, that can be done. If you're just like, oh, I don't want to become a big guy with a small neck, you probably won't. Just by heavy axial loading, your neck will certainly experience some amount of hypertrophy. Some people are going to be more prone to this than others. I myself have never really done any neck training, and my neck seems to indefinitely get thicker and thicker and thicker, just from doing SSBs and deadlifts. It doesn't stop, right? So just by getting really strong, your neck will probably get big. So if you're just worried about it looking disproportionate once you put on muscle, that issue very well might sort itself out. So I wouldn't worry too much. But yeah, what are the best foods for powerlifting? I think you should check out my top 7 foods for strength training video. I think I cover basically the ones I would recommend the most for the most part there. But basically, you're looking at easily digested carbs, rice, potatoes. You're looking at vegetables every day, probably cruciferous vegetables. You're looking at fruits spaced throughout the day, preferably more nutrient-dense fruits, so like not watermelon, more like berries, shit like that. And then you're looking at good fat sources, avocado, olive oil, maybe a bit of butter, coconut oil, stuff like that. And then for as far as protein sources, you're just looking for something with high nutrient density, so preferably something that's not white fish or chicken. But if that's what you need to do to get your macros as far as money goes, there's nothing wrong with that. You're still going to be getting a decent amount of micronutrients from your fruits, your veggies. Maybe just increase the quantity of those if you're unable to afford red meat or lamb, which I guess is a red meat, or salmon or cod or something that's more nutrient dense. I guess cod is a white fish, but it's got a good fatty acid profile. Yeah, I don't know. If you can and you can digest it, I generally suggest you select a rumenoid animal for most of your protein sourcing. So, cow, bison, lamb, something like that. And eggs. Eggs are great as long as you digest them well. Whole eggs are also a very good nutrient-dense source of protein and fat. Definitely eat them with the yolk. Powerlifting with varying days a week because of work hours. I saw that. So that's a great question. Basically, what I would recommend is instead of thinking, oh, Monday is squat day, Wednesday is bench day, Friday is deadlift day, something like that, a very consistent routine. Consistent routines are phenomenal for beginners just because it builds the idea of repetition and consistency in their head, because that is the central tenet of strength training is repetition and consistency. That being said, there's nothing magical about a 7-day split. So what you could easily do is if you've got 4 training days, they don't have to line up. You can run through that training days 1.5 times a week, or you could run through it once a week, or if you're really busy at work, you could run through it in slightly over a week. What I would do is I would just do these sessions in an order. So you have an A session, a B session, a C session, and a D session. Take your rest days whenever the work pops up in between those, or whenever you feel too heavily worked to do a good workout, push it off to the next day, come in and do the B session. After the B session, if your work's not too bad, come in and do the C session. Maybe you need a rest day, rest, D session, and then just run through that at whatever pace your schedule dictates. You don't necessarily have to worry about that lining up with a week, especially if you're not in preparation for a meet, so you don't need to do a certain number of microcycles in a certain number of weeks. You can be really lax with, hey, I feel like shit today, I'll just do it tomorrow so the workout goes better, or hey, I was planning on resting today, but I feel great, I'm gonna go work out. As long as you're honest with that stuff and you're kind of use your intuition, and your intuition is not leading you astray. If you're using your intuition as leading you astray, you might want to look at some more objective metrics. That's probably the best way to do it, is just divorce yourself from the idea that a microcycle needs to be a 7-day work week. It can be at any number of days, and it can vary with your work-based fatigue and limited time. So getting into the couple of questions on the last video, strategies and tips for transitioning from higher rep to less specific strength into heavier, more specific strength. So I'm going to guess you mean specific to a 1RM, in which case I think that the introduction of submaximal, emphasis on submaximal, singles is a very, very good way to begin building that technical skill and specific strength. So just running through the process of setting up, either walking out or unracking or getting tight, doing a single rep, and then you're done. Running through that process, starting at even as low as 80, 85%, and building from there rather than going straight to a heavy single and having nowhere to go from there, is a really good way to transition. So let's say I've done Just a rough example. We've done 4 weeks of like eights, put in like a pretty traditional hypertrophy phase, and then we did 4 weeks of fives, so a pretty traditional strength phase. And we want to transition into that more specific strength phase, like you said. What I would introduce probably is starting at like 83%, a single, and 86% the next week for a single, 89. I guess if we're coming off the strength phase, you could introduce that during the strength phase, right? So maybe we do an 83% single and then some back down fives, an 86% single and then some back down fives, an 89% single, back down fives, and then we transition to a more specific phase. We go 91% single or 92% single, back down threes, 95% single, back down threes, and then max. Usually I find that the most you need to touch for submaximal singles is about 95%. At that point, if you're going heavier than that, you're really not eking out that much more progress. You're just kind of drawing out the process a little bit needlessly and fatiguing yourself a little bit needlessly, spending more than 1 week above there. But yeah, basically I would just introduce some light singles, add a little bit of weight each week, try to work your way up to 95% before you go for a max, but just start practicing that specific skill of setting up for and executing a single. Mentally and physically, it will help a great deal. And as long as you're like solid in your technique, you don't need any overload work to touch heavy, like super maximal weights. More often that's not very necessary. We can just practice our technique and really get things locked in up to 95% and then max. More often than not, this is what I recommend to people. And then I think we have one more question. Best habits / things to do for ankle mobility. My squat looks terrible ever since I badly sprained my ankle. And it almost certainly has to do with ankle mobility. My knees can't get past my toes, and my torso folds forward like a taco to reach depth. I would love to be able to squat fairly upright, but my ankle mobility isn't allowing at the moment. I appreciate everything, man. Genuinely look forward to anything you post on IG or YouTube. Well, thank you. That means a lot to me. So first thing first, I also sprained my ankle super badly at some point, so I can come at this with some extra perspective. First things first is just mentioning that using heel elevated squat shoes can be very helpful. Just elevating the heel lessens the demands on the ankle to achieve a more upright posture. Definitely an option if you can't sort it out. But I recommend you go watch my like one simple tip for a better squat. Basically, it's just me advocating for spending 5 minutes a day sitting down in the bottom of a bodyweight squat, and gradually, if you do this every day, breaking it up however you need to, your ankles will improve in mobility. I find that especially coming off an ankle injury, the only thing that helped with my ankle mobility, which is historically quite bad and now is quite okay, was doing long duration stretches rather than more intense shorter duration stretches. And the most specific stretch you can do is sitting down at the bottom of a bodyweight squat. We're just we're spending more time exposing ourselves to the position that we want to be more mobile at. There's a good chance, in my opinion, that your inability to remain upright comes down to more than just your ankles. The ankles are kind of a red herring. Everyone thinks, well, my squat doesn't look gorgeous, it's because of ankles. I mean, it's probably due to a myriad of mobility issues and lack of motor pattern practice. Your adductors are probably tight, your hamstrings are probably a bit tight. So it's probably more multifactorial about that, and that's that's where the third world squat for 5 minutes really shines, is regardless of whatever we think is the limiting factor, we're stretching all the limiting factors at the same time in reasonable proportions to one another. So even if you are somewhat wrong and the adductors were a big portion of the issue, those will get stretched out by doing a good third world squat. We're not lazy, we're not collapsing onto the insides of our feet. That will get addressed as well. So just spending more time in that position you want to be good at, your body will make adaptations to that position, and entering that position will be easier. It just comes down to doing it, being diligent and doing it every day. You can watch that video for me going into a little bit more detail, but those long duration stretches in the specific positions tend to go a very, very long way over more isolated ankle stretching, because that's only one part of the equation more than likely. It's not just ankle mobility that's bad and the rest of you is super limber more often than not. Not talking to you specifically, just talking generally. Thank you guys for watching my video. It means a lot to me. I appreciate you all.